name is Wendy Pearlman. I'm a professor of political science at Northwestern University, and my new book is called The Home I Work to Make: Voices from the New Syrian Diaspora. So I began studying the Middle East during a college semester abroad in the mid-1990s, got hooked, and basically have been doing it ever since. I spent my first 10 years or so as a Middle East politics student and young professor focusing on Palestinian politics and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 2011, when the Arab uprisings began, I became captivated by the uprisings, as did most people in my field, and began studying Syria. My interest at that time was really how Syrians mustered the courage to go out and protest despite the extreme risks of repression. And I wanted to gather personal stories of protest to learn how people had that experience. So I began doing open-ended interviews with Syrians. As it was too dangerous to go inside Syria and do that kind of work, I began interviewing Syrians who had left the country as refugees. I started in 2012 and did that for about 12 years, traveling to countries in the Middle East and to Europe, eventually doing interviews over Zoom as well. Over now 12 years, I've interviewed more than 500 Syrian refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, expatriates about their lives. So I gathered all of these stories, and they were just sort of open opportunities for people to talk about the experience of the uprisings, the experience of authoritarianism, and more over time, the experience of displacement and becoming a refugee. So in 2017, I used the interviews that I had gathered to date to write a book called We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled: Voices from Syria. That book really aims to present a curation of fragments of interviews and interview excerpts to walk readers through the story of the Syrian uprising. That book ends with stories of people leaving Syria, but I said to myself that the Syrian story had not ended yet, and I kept going and collecting more and more interviews. So the interviews that I gathered between 2017 and about 2020 really came to focus more on the experience of displacement, whereas my first rounds of interviews were more focused on the experience of uprising and war. With time, I could see the component of exile becoming more and more prominent in Syrians' lives, as Syrians made sense of the fact that this displacement was likely to be long enduring, if not permanent, as people tried to make sense of what had happened. The early interviews really focused on chronicling these rapid fire events of the Syrian war. As time went on, the pace of events slowed. There wasn't the same need to document what was happening, but instead there was a need for those who had experienced these events to make sense of what had happened. I found many Syrians becoming quite introspective and thinking about, after all that's happened, so much loss, so much violence, so much destruction, so much upheaval, who have Syrians become as individuals, as a collective? What does it mean to have experienced this kind of war? So the latter interviews focus on this self-probing, this self-discovery, this making sense of war, of violence, prolonged displacement, and the experience of being a newcomer all over the world. Many Syrians are now living in places where they never even imagined they would visit, and now they're making lives there, learning languages, restarting professional careers, raising children. So this is a book that captures this latter phase of the Syrian conflict. It begins with stories of Syrians leaving Syria, then follows their journeys. And over the years, I came to focus on the theme of home. It was something that I saw emerging organically in people's stories, and it became a lens through which to understand these experiences. So the book starts with stories of leaving home and then follows journeys of making sense of losing home, of searching for new homes, of finding home, of perhaps not finding home, of believing in the power of home, or perhaps not even believing in the idea of home, and ultimately really rethinking what home even means. And part of the idea of the book is not only to share these Syrian experiences of home and meaning making, but also to explore what people who are not refugees can learn from refugees about home. One of the reasons that I like to focus on home is that it's a universal human experience. every human being can connect with the idea of home. So you can ask yourself, what does home mean to you? And maybe you have a quick answer to the question of what is home, or maybe not. Maybe home is associated with really positive, wonderful things. Maybe it has some negative connotations, some confused, complicated connotations. The question of home probably resonates with you in some way. I think it can resonate with any human being. You get it. It enters your heart. You know what I'm talking about when I ask about home. For many people, if I'd ask about war and exile, they wouldn't have the same reaction. It seems like something that other people experience, maybe people far away. But home is something that we all share. So in focusing on home, I wanted to bring non-refugees into the conversation so they also could think about home, but also see what they could learn from refugees. So the book is a way, I always say, of not only learning about displacement and about refugees, but a learning from refugees, because these are folks who've thought very deeply about the meaning of home, because they've been forced to flee home, because they are now finding themselves facing the challenge of making home in radically new places, sometimes far from their families, because they're making sense of the fact that the home that they once thought of as home, where they may have were born and grown up, might no longer exist in the same way, or it's a place they can't go back to and ever see again. All of this provokes a lot of thinking about home. Whether people want to think about home or not, this experience provokes some deep thinking. So I want the book to challenge everyone, whether you've experienced displacement or not, to listen to these stories, to listen to these reflections, to learn from them. And you might just change your own idea of home, or think about it with new eyes, in ways that, especially those who can take home for granted because they've never had to leave, because they've lived in the same place, because they're relatively secure in their physical safety and in their rights. They just might not have given it that much thought. And there's a lot we can learn and benefit from those who have given it a lot of thought, because they've experienced the kind of things that Syrians have. So to be honest, I actually did not begin with an interest in displacement at all. I was interested in the Syrian uprising, and because it was dangerous to do interviews inside Syria, I began interviewing Syrian refugees. So in some ways, it was just the safer, more convenient, more logical choice and way to access Syrian stories. But my first interviews were absolutely focused on their experiences in Syria. So I began this project really not interested in refugees or displacement at all. But as the years went by, I could see the refugee component of people's lives become more and more salient, more and more prominent, and very sadly, more and more permanent. So I was brought into the displacement element simply by following people over many years. And I saw their experiences with displacement change. In the beginning, most of my interviewees didn't even consider themselves to be refugees. They thought they were people who had just traveled a matter of kilometers to get out of the way of bombing, and they were going to return back to their houses anytime. And with each passing year, I could see that becoming a new reality emerging, in which people came to cope with the fact that they might not return. And that's what got me interested in refugees and displacement. And part of, I think, what has triggered my real interest and passion for it is that privilege to be able to see how it's transformed year after year. At some point, refugee populations might become relatively stable, relatively long lasting. And we forget that it didn't always begin that way, that becoming a refugee is a set of circumstances that any human being can endure. There can be war or persecution in any place, and someone might find themselves forced to flee. Being a refugee is not a type of person, it's a set of circumstances that can happen to any individual, and it's a dynamic set of circumstances. And people are coping with and making sense of and understanding a situation that is evolving, that's changing. And displacement might be one stage along the road of this journey, and we can intersect with it as scholars and students at different points, but it's always useful to remember that it's just one stage and to see it in context, and to also go backwards and try to understand what a person's life was before they became a refugee or became to see themselves as a refugee. And likewise, we can look to the future and wonder, will this person always be a refugee? Or at some point, do they become a citizen, a neighbor, a friend, a resident, and not have that label? Or do they want to have that label? Or are they given that label whether they want to or not? So one of the things I find most interesting about displacement is situating displacement in a larger context and situating displacement in the larger context of an individual's life, both before displacement and what happens afterwards. So we are living in a time when there is a lot of anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiment. We see it in the United States, we see it in Europe, we see it around the world. So there are many roles that universities can play, but one is to foster understanding and knowledge, and hopefully understanding and knowledge that also leads to empathy, that leads to individuals who do not have a refugee background coming to appreciate what refugees have endured, and also all they have to offer. So universities in fostering research, in undertaking teaching, and in doing public programming for the larger community can really help play that role.